In the quiet suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia, stood the Harrington estate. A mansion so massive it seemed carved out of arrogance itself. Marble pillars gleamed under the southern sun, while iron gates separated the world of wealth from the world of struggle. Inside those walls, chandeliers spilled golden light across velvet carpets. Guests arrived in sleek black cars, their laughter echoing like a chorus of privilege. But not everyone who walked those halls shared in the luxury. In the corners behind the polished silver trays and folded linens moved Rosa, an aging black maid, her back bent from years of service, her hands rough from endless scrubbing. She wore a simple uniform, her hair wrapped tight, her eyes heavy with secrets she never dared speak aloud. The Harringtons barely saw her anymore. To them, she was part of the furniture. She blended into the background, serving drinks, picking up discarded glasses, making sure their perfect world never cracked. But Rosa carried a burden that money couldn't erase. In a cramped apartment across town, her daughter Layla lay fighting for her life. The bills stacked higher every week, and the doctors demanded payments Rosa could never afford. She had begged, borrowed, and prayed. But nothing was enough. And on that night, as she wiped down the marble counters and heard the clinking of champagne glasses in the distance, Rosa made a choice that would change everything. The Harrington mansion had always been a vault of wealth. Rosa had dusted those shelves, polished those safes, counted stacks of bills as if they were another piece of furniture. To her, it was a cruel reminder. So much money sat untouched, while her daughter's life slipped away. She tried to push the thought away. She tried to remind herself of her faith, of her morals, of the life she had built on hard work. But when she looked at Layla's pale face in the hospital, tubes running from her arms, the decision became clearer. It wasn't about greed. It wasn't about theft. It was survival. One evening, after cleaning up from another lavish dinner, Rosa walked into the study. The room smelled of leather and old cigars. On the mahogany desk sat a checkbook, a lockbox, and a pile of bills waiting for Harrington's signature. Her hands trembled as she reached for the pen. She told herself it was a loan. She would pay it back. She would work double shifts, triple shifts if she had to. She just needed to buy her daughter time. The check she wrote was small compared to Harrington's wealth, barely noticeable in the ocean of riches he swam in daily. But to Rosa, it was life itself. She slipped it into her purse, her heart pounding like thunder in her chest. And when she left that study, she left behind more than just the weight of secrecy. She left behind her innocence. For a while, Rosa's plan worked. Layla received her treatment. Color returned to her cheeks, and her laughter echoed once more in the tiny apartment Rosa called home. For the first time in months, hope bloomed. But secrets never stay buried in places like the Harrington mansion. Numbers didn't add up. Ledgers showed gaps, and whispers started to crawl across the marble floors. One evening, during a glittering gala, Harrington's voice cut through the music like a whip. He had discovered the missing funds, and he was furious. The guests watched as Rosa was summoned into the center of the ballroom. Her knees trembled, her hands shook, her heart knew what was coming. Harrington's face burned red with rage. He accused her not with questions, but with certainty. He painted her as a thief, a liar, a woman unworthy of trust. In front of hundreds of eyes, he stripped her of dignity she had spent a lifetime holding on to. The room fell silent. No one defended her. No one asked why. They saw only a black maid and a white billionaire, and their judgment was instant. Rosa stood frozen, her cheeks burning, her soul shattered. She wanted to scream the truth, but the words caught in her throat. The humiliation was too deep, the power imbalance too sharp. And then, just like that, she was gone. Rosa left the mansion under a storm of whispers. Her name carried like poison through the city's elite circles. Doors that once opened for her slammed shut. Job offers disappeared. Even her church pew felt colder, as though the congregation looked at her differently now. Her daughter's treatment continued, but the shadow of shame followed them everywhere. At the grocery store, people stared. At the hospital, nurses whispered. Rosa felt the walls of the world closing in, suffocating her. Yet in the silence of her small kitchen, Rosa whispered prayers. She prayed for forgiveness, for strength, for Layla's healing. She prayed not for revenge, but for survival. And though the world had cast her out, Rosa refused to let bitterness consume her. She kept working odd jobs, scrubbing floors, ironing clothes, doing whatever she could to keep the lights on. But deep down, she knew this story wasn't over. Back at the Harrington estate, things were far from perfect. The viral age had no mercy, and guests had recorded the night of Rosa's humiliation. The video spread online like wildfire. Millions watched the footage of a wealthy white billionaire berating his black maid in front of a ballroom. They saw her trembling hands, her silent tears, the cruel tone of Harrington's voice. Outrage erupted. Comments poured in. This woman gave her whole life to that house, and this is how she's treated? Money doesn't buy you class. Look at this cruelty. She wasn't even given a chance to explain. This is America, in one video. Harrington's empire began to crack. Investors pulled away. The media circled like vultures. His name, once a symbol of untouchable wealth, now carried the stench of scandal. But Rosa? She didn't care for their gossip. She cared only for her daughter. It was an accountant who discovered it. Late one night, combing through the records, he noticed something. The withdrawal Rosa had made wasn't hidden. It was logged under a long-forgotten employee emergency fund, an old policy Harrington's late wife had once insisted on. The realization spread quickly. Rosa hadn't stolen in secrecy. She had used a system meant to help workers in desperate times, a system Harrington himself had ignored for years. When the truth reached him, Harrington felt the weight of guilt settle in. He had destroyed a woman's reputation, humiliated her in public, and labeled her a thief, all while ignoring the policy his own wife had created. And for the first time in decades, Harrington felt small. The revelation hit the public like a storm. Articles flooded the internet, flipping the story on its head. Rosa was no longer seen as a criminal, but as a mother making an impossible choice. Photos of Layla in her hospital bed surfaced, sparking nationwide empathy. Donations poured in. Messages of support filled her mailbox. People who had once turned their backs now apologized, ashamed of how quickly they had judged her. Rosa never asked for their pity, but she accepted their solidarity. Because for the first time, she didn't feel alone. Harrington reached out, requesting a meeting. Rosa almost refused. Why should she face the man who had crushed her dignity? But in the end, she went, not for him, but for herself. The meeting took place in a downtown office. Harrington's arrogance was gone, replaced by exhaustion and shame. He apologized, not just for the accusation, but for the way he had seen her, as less than human. Rosa listened quietly. She didn't offer easy forgiveness. Forgiveness was earned, not handed out like candy. But Harrington took action. He created a foundation in Rosa's name, dedicated to helping working-class families cover medical expenses. It wasn't charity, it was reparations. A recognition of his failure and a vow to do better. Months passed. Rosa's life began to bloom again. Layla's health improved, her laughter filling their small apartment. Rosa's fridge stayed full, her bills paid, her heart lighter. The community, once quick to condemn, now lifted her up. Neighbors stopped by with food. Strangers greeted her with respect. Her name, once dragged through the mud, now carried weight, and Rosa didn't waste her second chance. She began speaking at community centers, telling her story to other struggling mothers. She turned her pain into purpose, reminding others that dignity could survive even in the harshest storms. The Harrington Foundation grew rapidly, funding treatments for sick children across the state. On paper, it carried Harrington's name. But in spirit, everyone knew it was Rosa's story that fueled it. Rosa never returned to the mansion. She didn't need to. Her legacy wasn't tied to marble floors or chandeliers. It lived in the lives of families, saved from the suffering she had once endured. And though she never sought revenge, justice had found her in its own way. The man who once saw her as disposable now owed his reputation to her name. The world had been forced to see her truth. In the end, Rosa's story wasn't about money. It wasn't about scandal. It was about love, the kind of love that risks everything, that survives humiliation, that turns pain into hope. The world had once called her a thief. Now they called her what she always was, a mother, a fighter, a woman of unshakable strength. And as she watched Layla run through a sunlit park one afternoon, Rosa whispered to herself with quiet triumph, "They tried to take my dignity, but they couldn't take my love. And love is everything."